Hey everybody, I am officially showing my paintbrushes, the paper that I'm using. I went ahead and sketched it out with a Prismacolor Color Erase in Scarlet Red. And I have my brushes, my Regina watercolor palette, and then I get to it. Now, I went ahead and filmed this pretty fast because I didn't think you'd want to watch an entire video of me painting. However, I wanted to show a few tips and tricks that I have learned in my very short watercolor experience. I went ahead and made what is, a fleshy tone out of the colors that I had. And I go ahead and start by making the faintest, lightest color of the flesh possible. You go ahead and can make the darker highlights and shadows and things, but it's the easiest to put on the lightest shade first. So I'm just laying out mostly a flat tone here, and I'm using almost all round brushes. I think this one here is an 8 round, and I went ahead and picked up some of that paint just with my finger. And that's the easiest thing, when you have wet paint, especially if you catch it really quick, it can come up pretty easily with watercolor. It's pretty forgiving. So now I am starting to get a darker hue. And if you can see around the edges, I'm putting in that dark tone, putting in some blush in her nose and her cheeks. And I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be fussing with those cheeks for a while, if I recall correctly. I'm putting in the darker tone, and depending upon whether you want a more stark line versus wanting that shadow to kind of fill in and be a little more subtle and blended, you go ahead and put in that dark hue and then water down your brush to blend out some of those harsher edges. And yeah, I'm just good old fingers there, using that to blot up some of the paint. So again, part of learning how to work with watercolors is knowing how to blend. And here I put in the dark gray in the corners, and then I touched the still wet paint with a wet brush. It's a clean wet brush to kind of get it to blend out and spread. And these lips are going to give me some trouble. I come back and touch these up several times. Mostly, however, I am trying to get this rosy tone, and one of the things that I think is important to learn is not going back in next to wet paint. And I'm absolutely going to break this rule right now. So I touched the black paint to the red paint, which isn't really dry. And because it's wet on wet, if you are familiar with wet on wet technique, the paint and pigment spread where water is. I'm going to go back once that dries. So here we are, going back in for the eyes. And I had a couple ideas for the eyes. I wanted the idea to be this relatively pretty face, and I want it to be sick. Kind of a discussion on, I guess, like mental illness and how some illnesses are invisible because someone can look just fine and they're still very sick inside. I start in with this really pretty tone, and I just don't like it. It's very pretty and kind of like this aquamarine color. And so I have to wait for it to dry to kind of come back and see whether or not I enjoy it. I have a finer line paintbrush for things like eyebrows. And there I go, get it. But then I go to the hair. Yeah, so I'm jumping around mostly, I think, because I want to make sure that I don't touch, wet to dry. And I went in and got a bigger brush because, and I think this is a filbert, it's a flatter brush that still kind of has a soft round edge to kind of fill in more of this space. So I'm able to kind of fill in more space with less time. And I'm just kind of laying down the lightest hue of the hair. Yeah, so I'm putting down the hair. And frankly, if I'm honest, hair is one of those things that I kind of struggle with. I've been watching a lot of great tutorials on Skillshare and watching some of my favorite YouTubers, like Emily Artful, Painting with Waffles. I'll post all of those links in my description. They have some great recommendations on tutorials and things like that. Here we go with that finer line. And I'm coming around to put in the shadows. So that's where I went ahead and got, I put in that darker hue. And then once I'm done filling in that line, it's real dark, then I went back in and got my paintbrush wet to soften out those edges so that it looks less like a defined line and more of a blend of the paint. And I still haven't found out a great setup yet for this. I keep bumping my camera, and so for that I apologize. I'm just kind of working with what I have, and I'm still fussing with those lips. This is not going to be the last time I touch those lips. So now I go in and I get some more of like the earthy green colors to kind of muddy up this ick that's pouring out. And I put a little black to define some of the shadow areas to kind of indicate depth. It is something that I'm working with. Well, it is at this point something that you start adding in more shading and different things to give the painting a little bit of dimension. I'm trying to flesh in some eyelids there to give a little dimension. And now I'm going back around and filling in some of the pupil. I wasn't exactly sure at this point still what I was doing with the eyes. I wanted them to be kind of similar to the color of the ick that was coming out, the decay. And I'm going back in and fussing with the highlighting for the nose. I wasn't really feeling what was happening there. So I just fussed around. Once the pigments were really drying. Oh, and there's my fine liner. There we go. And this is where I start really getting some of the good fiddly details. I start painting in the individual eyebrow hairs. And oh girl needs a little bit of work here. But we're going back in. And at this point, I start making mistakes. And I guess the reason that I'm leaving these in is because it's important that, you see the mistakes along the way as well, because I learn from them. And I just start going around and touching up things and forgetting which layers were painted last and which ones had dried. And so I'm just kind of going around putting dark shadows in the green, like sludgy areas, the ooze. But then I also went around to the edges of the nose and the edges of her eyes. I'm trying to kind of get the prettiness of the like aquamarine color. I'm trying to get that really good. Okay, so I finished with the actual painting and I waited for it to dry. And now I'm going back in with my fine point microns. I think that one is a 0.1. And my dog is barking. It's very helpful. And really, I'm just tracing around the edges, highlighting and defining the spaces. And I'm sort of filling in some of the areas that I feel like I didn't really fill in. And you'll see me hold my pen out for a minute, just watching like, okay, where do I go now? Now, this is one of my brush pens. I honestly wore the brand name off of it so long ago I couldn't even tell you what it is, but it's a soft point brush pen, and I'm in love with it, and I've used it forever, and it's been with me, I feel like, for 4 or 5 years. And I go back in and I kind of fill in some of the spaces that need more definition. And sometimes your image won't need that. I feel like I really wanted this to pop, and so I went through and started putting in, hairlines and other outline to kind of make the pop. And frankly, I like the very pale watercolor against the sharp black markers. I feel like it makes the watercolor, it's a really good contrast where the watercolor itself is faint and kind of light and lovely. There I go, bumping the camera again. But the watercolor is faint and lovely, and the pen lines are just sharp and dark. I think it's a really neat contrast, and I really enjoy it. Way to stick your whole hand in the middle of the screen. Well, I guess that's it. So if you have any more questions, hit me up, like, subscribe, send me some notes. Thanks and have a great day. Take care.